Welcome to the Point. This has been an unprecedented week in covering politics. The riots and subsequent storming of the U.S. Capitol is something that none of us have ever seen. The day after the events in Washington, I talked with some of our lawmakers about what those dramatic moments were like and what's next for the country. First, freshman Congressman Peter Meijer from the 3rd District, who experienced all of this in his first week in office. Congressman, for being in office as few days as you have, we have had a lot of contact because it's been a very consequential time. We talked about the events of Wednesday in advance, about what the expectation was, what your hope was. We talked immediately in the aftermath of the Capitol being stormed, and now that we have the advantage of looking back 24 or almost 24 hours, give me your take on what happened in the Capitol this week.
Yeah, I think there was a large number of folks who were being told, that they were being told lies. They were being misled. They were being told that, this election would be overturned. They were being told that there was a massive fraud, that there was massive stealing of the vote going on, despite no court cases ruling in that, despite no investigatory efforts by law enforcement finding that to bear any fruit. And they expected that things would change and that a revolution was brewing. And we saw yesterday the culmination of that deception. We saw the culmination of that incitement and the rampage, the attack on our Capitol. As we spoke with, I was up in the House gallery watching the proceedings regarding the certification of Arizona's electoral college votes. It was chaotic. We grabbed smoke masks. We were ushered out with police who had drawn their weapons. There were folks banging to get into the chamber. We had to, go to several different locations trying to figure out where was secure. We didn't know what was going on. Obviously, it was a failure on a number of fronts from a security logistical standpoint, but also just a failure of our political process and a failure from, leaders who, kept perpetuating lies. I don't know if they were just trying to double down on some political propositions, if they were trying to cynically fundraise, but there are bloodstains in the Capitol today. And I hope all of those who egg this on, take a hard look in the mirror and understand the consequence and the gravity. That rhetoric is not divorced from reality.
I was talking with one of your Democratic colleagues in Congressman Dan Kildee, and I was talking about the political divide, and he said he doesn't see this as so much a political divide, and he singled out Congressman Molinar and Congressman Upton and yourself as being people who he said stood tall during yesterday's events. And so not so much Republican-Democrat chasm, but those who he said were fanning the flames. What is your thought? I mean, you just called out some of those people that you said were maybe cynically fundraising. I mean, what does that do in the Republican caucus? Because those would have been Republican members you're talking about.
And I'll have to add, Congressman Huizenga was with us as well. I think we had a strong, showing of support from the West Michigan and Southwest Michigan delegations, and with Representative Molinar, a little bit of Central Michigan too. That's the pivotal question right now, is where do we go from here? I signed on to a letter with Chip Roy out of Texas and Ken Buck as well on Tuesday, saying we wouldn't object to certifying the electoral college votes because there was no constitutional basis for that as our role, in addition to a number of other logical and procedural and just factual flaws in the argument being made to try to overturn this election. At the end of the day, that letter had everyone from Tea Party Freedom Caucus to, folks who are as establishment as the day is long and everything in between. So this doesn't hew along party lines. This doesn't hew along some of the traditional dividing lines that we've seen from an ideological standpoint in the House. There was a number of folks who, put the principles, where they were. And weren't looking for what was politically expedient. Chip Roy said that he was probably signing his political death warrant. I could have very well done the same. We'll have to see what happens in 2022. But I'm proud of the folks who, stood and said, we care about upholding the Constitution. We care about the principles, that we have dedicated our careers towards. And this isn't, what's the point of being a leader? What's the point of being a member of Congress if all you're interested in is saving your own skin?
Finally, I want to ask you about something that has come up. It came up during the events of Wednesday night. We've heard more about it as we've gone along, the possibility of the cabinet invoking the 25th Amendment or even Congress taking some action. Time is short for the president. Should any of those actions be undertaken?
Yeah, at this point, I think all those conversations are evolving. I'll say I'm looking at a couch that I slept on last night on about 3 hours. I'm about to go down to get some coffee. I said last night there have to be repercussions for all those who either incited this, egged it on, participated. This was an unprecedented assault on the Capitol, on the People's House, on our democracy. The Capitol we have not lost control of the Capitol in over 200 years. And we had members of both houses chased out by an angry mob that sought to overturn an election, that sought to disrupt the functioning of our government. That's insurrection. That's inexcusable. So there have to be consequences for that. In terms of where we go with the president, I don't know. Those are conversations that I'm sure are evolving, and we'll probably have more about soon.
Democratic Congressman Dan Kildee from Flint was also in the chamber when the Capitol was breached. He talks about his experience and significantly about his takeaway about some of his colleagues across the aisle. Congressman, what we saw happen in the chambers of the United States Capitol this week is unprecedented. Give me your first thought when this all started kind of falling down around you.
Well, I was there in the chamber. A few of us from Michigan were there because we were preparing to offer the defense of the Michigan challenge, which ultimately never came after all this went down. And I had moved to the gallery, and it was just frightening to see the security people come in and quickly usher out the speaker and the majority leader and the Republican whip. And then they announced that this mob had entered the Capitol and they were in the rotunda coming our way. The whole series of events that unfolded was like a blur to me, but we were stuck there, laying on the floor, hiding behind a wall, hearing gunfire and tear gas, and watching as this mob broke the door, smashed the window on that door that is normally swung open for the president to come and give the State of the Union. That's where they tried to enter, and where the Capitol Police and our own security detail drew their weapons. I've never been anything through it. I'm still, a little shaky, just as not so much from a political standpoint, but this was a personal experience for me that I've never had, and I think we've got a lot of questions to ask about how this happened. And Rick, I got to be honest with you, I'm not giving a lot of space to some of my colleagues who have been fanning the flames of this fire for months and months and taking the benefit from this whipped up sentiment, but now trying to divorce themselves from the ultimate act that was clearly part and parcel of whipping up all of this nonsense and falsehood about a stolen election, which is 100% completely nonsense.
You talked about giving little space to some of your colleagues who you said had been fanning the flame. And that brings me to the question of the long-lasting impact of this. In my lifetime, I've seen the division in politics and that chasm grow, and it has grown ever larger. I've never really seen us come back together in a significant way. With this event of yesterday and what you were just talking about, how much more difficult does that make it to come to some kind of compromise on anything when the two sides or multiple sides seem so far apart?
I think this is one of those cases that does not fall into the sort of conventional political divide. Because, I sat there on the floor of the House for the entire debate and saw some of the most conservative members of Congress, Republicans, a person like Chip Roy, for example, from Texas, with whom I have very little in common, give, I think, one of the strongest, most impassioned speeches against this nonsense that was offered on the floor of the House. And I went to Chip when we were done, and I said, look, man, you and I don't agree on a lot of stuff, but I look at you differently now. And I hope that lasts, because you're a person of integrity. the reason I say that is that there are basically two lists that were written yesterday. There were the lists of people who were willing to put country in the Constitution and their devotion to this democracy first. And there are the people who were afraid of the Trump base. And I don't mean all the Trump voters, but this sort of whipped up, really antagonistic group of people, like the ones who showed up. These political leaders, so-called leaders, that are so afraid of that base that privately have admitted the only reason that they were supporting this challenge to the Electoral College vote is because they would pay a heavy political price if they didn't. I put those people on a different list. It's not Democrats and Republicans. It just so happens that they're all Republicans, but I don't consider them Republicans. The Republicans, the people who were the Republicans, were people like Chip Roy or Fred Upton or John Molinar or Peter Meyer. I may be missing some, but I've talked to each of them, and they stood tall yesterday against the president of their own party and against a base who are going to remember and take it out on them. So I think we have a chance, ironically, to come together after this, having been through this experience. And the difference, the separation, isn't going to necessarily be partisan. It will be between those people who had the will and the steel and the guts to stand up to this. You know, as Democrats, we were sort of expected to. I feel strongly about this view, but it's those Republicans who were willing to do the hard thing. My neighbor, John Molinar, willing to do the hard thing, that stood the tallest yesterday.
Still, another member of Michigan's congressional delegation had a different experience as the confrontation in the nation's capital broke out. We'll have that perspective next. To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. What happened in Washington, D.C. this past week has been jarring for many Americans. To get some perspective about what happened, we talked to a number of people on the Hill when the violence broke out. We continue that conversation with Congressman Fred Upton. I've been talking with a lot of your colleagues trying to figure out exactly what it was like on the House floor when protesters were able to breach those doors. Give me your take of what it was like.
Well, I wasn't on the floor exactly when it happened. I was in the Capitol shortly before, and I was watching it in my office on C-SPAN, watch the debate, because they asked us, because of social distancing, not to have literally a joint session, 533 members on the House floor. So I thought I would just watch the debate and go over and participate when I was going to be ready. Should they have challenged Michigan's, which they didn't, and obviously be there to cast the vote. So, but we watched it on C-SPAN. I've got a balcony in my office, you know. Flash bangs. I saw the 100,000 plus protesters not only marched down to the ellipse, but also marched back. In my perch from my office, I could see literally, 60, 80, 100 different squad cars. I saw the Virginia State Police come up, some of the National Guard, the ATF. They closed Independence Avenue. They put up the bomb doors literally right below. You could hear the crowd. And I watched some of the network TV in terms of what was going on. But it was wild. We got a lot of and crazy. We've got a lot of emails from the Sergeant of Arms and Capitol Hill Police to stay locked down, talk to a number of members on the phone in various locations, but it was a rough day. There's no question about it.
I hope at some point we'll have time to discuss this more fully, but as I think about this as we're talking, I'm very interested, curious, concerned about what happens next. This obviously showed a segment of the population that is still very, very angry over this election. And while the election is not in question, it has been certified, there are still people that have real grave concerns about that. How do lawmakers, how do leaders deal with that?
Well, it's got to start at the top. And that's why so many of us are disappointed with what the president said yesterday, not only to incite the crowd to go up to the Capitol, his failure to really address it as he watched too. I mean, these scenes were there. We knew he was watching. To see these anarchists stormed the Capitol. I mean, similar to what happened back in 1812 when the British burned the Capitol. I mean, these folks may have been capable of doing that as they smashed through windows and stole stuff. 4 people died, 1 shot, probably by the Capitol Hill police. Just a tragic day as they tried to stop the wheels of democracy, the Constitution, from moving forward. And the only way to, I mean, the outcome was never in doubt, never in doubt. Overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate to affirm every single state's vote certification. So for folks to have sort of the miscalculation that the vice president was going to simply by waving his hand and reading a statement to decertify states and undo the election was never going to happen. So it is responsibility on all of us, from the president on down, our civics teachers and others, news media, to really share this, to get these conspiracy thoughts out of people's minds, to think that by a brute force, and I'm seeing some of the comments today, some wanted to occupy the Capitol until the 20th, until Inauguration Day, to confirm that it would be Donald Trump that would be taking the oath of office. I mean, I don't know what kind of dream they're having, but there was never in the cards. And certainly not as a democracy, the very republic that we all learned to love a long time ago.
You mentioned that the president has to take responsibility. There are those who think that the president should leave before the 20th. Do you think that should happen?
Well, there's 2 ways to make him leave. One is the 25th Amendment, and that's something that the vice president would initiate, where he would get with at least a majority of the cabinet members to affirm that the president should be removed. There is that option. Only he can exercise that. I don't know whether he will or not. It seems like they're a little bit on thin ice in terms of the relationship, unlike what they've had for the last 3 and 11/12 of a year. The other, of course, is impeachment. Congress is out of session now until no votes until the 21st. I won't be going back until the 19th to be there for the inauguration. So to do an impeachment trial, a House verdict, a Senate trial, it's not in the cards. So, I think that the discussion, I'll say this, I think the discussion that's out there, particularly with the 25th Amendment, a number of folks reminding the president that that's there, is a pretty good signal that he better be on good behavior the last 12 days.
Earlier, I spoke to Governor Gretchen Whitmer. We talked about the episode in D.C. before talking about a vastly expanded COVID vaccination plan. Governor, I want to talk about some big developments in the way that the COVID-19 vaccine is going to be stepped up here in the state and the delivery of that. But before we get there, I have to look at yesterday's activities as we talked. This is on Thursday. It was on Wednesday when we saw something that we've never seen at the nation's capital. I know you've spoken about it, but give me your take on where we are today.
I think it was heartbreaking to see what played out in Washington, D.C. last night. And those of us here in Michigan who've been paying attention know that this isn't the first time this has happened. We saw this play out in our state capitol. People storming the Capitol, bringing automatic rifles in order to intimidate legislators. We saw that happen here in Lansing. As a result of that, I reached out and called on the White House. I called on Mike Pence. I talked to him individually. I called on our Republican leaders in our legislature. Help bring down the heat. That's when the death threats started. That's when I reached out, and they didn't do anything. Later this year, we saw it culminate in some of the same people that were at our Capitol in a plot to kidnap and murder me. This is what happens when people with platforms either use them to encourage it or don't use them to discourage it. Every one of us, people of goodwill, have a duty to recognize that it is our democracy, the foundations of our nation, that come before us individually and come before our political parties. And I think that's what was so heartbreaking to see happen last night, because we knew that this was a possibility because we saw it play out here in Michigan.
Just quickly, there has been some conversation about efforts to remove the president before the 20th. Do you have a thought on that?
You know, I'm not in the cabinet. I'm not the vice president, so I'm not going to weigh in on the 25th Amendment. That's for them to debate. And I'm not a member of Congress. They can debate whether or not articles of impeachment are appropriate. I am focused on getting our state through this pandemic. We are working hard to make sure that we get vaccines in arms. We are doing building out what we can. We need more support and help from the federal government. And so if not in the next 13 days, I've got great confidence, at least with a new administration, that we will, as a country, do a lot better with COVID and getting our economy back on track.
When you announced that there would be vaccines or people would be available to be vaccinated, 65 and above, teachers, and a number of other workers, that was a considerable expansion of what you wanted to do as far as vaccinations go. But we're hearing from county health departments that while they love the idea, they don't have the vaccines. And you said yourself that one of the things would happen is that you should run out every week. That would be good news because more people would be getting vaccinated. So the reality is the expansion is there, but the vaccines aren't going to be. And do we have any idea when?
So, you know, I was on the phone with Pfizer. Obviously, they've got a freezer farm right in Portage, Michigan. I've been talking to them regularly. The federal government has not released 55 million vaccines that they have in their freezer farms. This is an incredible frustration because we know it's going to take time for us to ramp up. It's going to take time to get a shot in an arm. It takes 15 minutes before you know if you're going to have a reaction. I mean, this is an incredibly cumbersome process, and yet we're already at a point where we're anticipating running out of vaccines. Meanwhile, in this freezer farm here in Michigan, there are Pfizer vaccines ready to go. And that's why I'm calling on the Department of Health and Human Services at the national level to release these vaccines so that we can build up this apparatus and move faster. Because if we are to stay at the pace that we're on currently, it'll take over a year for us to vaccinate everyone in Michigan, and that's unacceptable, especially when the vaccines are just down the road sitting in a freezer farm.
Have you given consideration, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that there are some National Guard troops that are already being employed to help with the vaccinations and with this rollout. Will there be a larger presence of National Guard or larger vaccination centers, or do you anticipate this will all be happening in existing medical facilities?
No, I think that you'll see some creative ways of getting people vaccinated in higher numbers at a quicker pace. Just for instance, I was talking with the mayor of Detroit, and we'll be doing a drive-through vaccination clinics in Detroit. The thing about this vaccine, though, is it's got to be stored cold, and you have to have 15 minutes after the shot is given. And so we need people to be able to stay there. And we obviously can't congregate, so filling a stadium doesn't make sense, even if you didn't have winter like we do here in Michigan. So there are a lot of logistical challenges here, but we're working with our partners at the local public health departments, our partners in the pharmacists, as well as organizations like Lansing Urgent Care that's helping out right here in the Ingham County Health Department. It's got to be all hands on deck, a collaboration unlike anything we've ever seen if we're going to move swiftly. And we must move swiftly because, Rick, I think it's important to point out this variant, this mutated COVID-19 is even more contagious than the original. And I'm not saying that to scare people. It's just a factor in terms of how quickly we want to move, because should that become present and in a very in a big way, it's going to be a lot harder for us to get our arms around this. And so that's why moving swiftly now, getting these vaccines out of that freezer farm and into people's arms is really, really important.
A final thought when we come back to the point. For decades, we have watched elections come and go with a certain predictability about the peaceful transition of power. This year, like so much of the last 4 years, it was different, much different. Still, just days from now, peaceful transfer will occur. A new administration will have their shot at governance, and we'll be watching every week right here to the point.